Greetings to you all. This is Tendai Dumbuchena, host of the podcast Africa in Crisis. Welcome to episode 5, which poses the question, does former President Thabo Mbeki bear some of the responsibility for the presence of so many Zimbabweans in South Africa? The presence of undocumented foreigners in South Africa is now a hot-button political issue which may determine how people vote in provincial and national elections in 2024. This past week, the MEC for Health in Limpopo province, Dr. Poppy Ramathuba, berated a Zimbabwean migrant who had sought treatment at a hospital in Bilabila. 4 months from now, about 150,000 Zimbabweans whose special dispensation permits to work in South Africa expired at the end of last year face deportation. But what has this got to do with Mr. Mbeki? In 2000, when ZANU-PF in Zimbabwe faced real prospect of electoral defeat for the first time since it was voted into power in 1980, all hell broke loose. Politically motivated state-sponsored violence against the opposition movement for democratic change supporters, invasion of white-owned commercial farms which tanked the economy, and rigged and violent elections sent Zimbabwe on a downward spiral. To solve what were extremely worrying developments in Zimbabwe, President Mbeki was tasked by the Southern African Development Community SADC to mediate. At this juncture, one point must be made clear. Mbeki was not responsible for the human rights violations, rigged elections, the reckless manner in which the land issue was handled, and the economic meltdown that inevitably followed. The culprits were the ZANU-PF government. Mbeki's culpability lies in the biased manner in which he executed his role as mediator. He lacked objectivity and even-handedness. He chose to side with a sister liberation movement despite his own government's and SADC's position on democracy, governance, and human rights. His partiality towards ZANU-PF and antipathy towards the MDC emboldened the former to continue to use foul means to remain in power. With elections due next year in Zimbabwe, violence has already begun against supporters of opposition leader Nelson Chamisa's Citizens Coalition for Change. During the years of Mbeki's mediation, there were warnings that failure to end ZANU-PF's aberrant behavior would lead to Zimbabweans flooding into South Africa. These warnings were not heeded. Besides SADC, the Commonwealth was also seized with the Zimbabwe issue, and Mbeki was one of the protagonists. At the Commonwealth Summit held in 2001 in Australia, it was decided to send an observer team to monitor the presidential election in Zimbabwe a year later. The decision was taken in response to state-sponsored violence that had already started in the lead-up to the election. The observer team would present its report to a troika of Commonwealth leaders, namely Mbeki, Nigeria's Olusegun Obasanjo, and John Howard of Australia. The report unequivocally condemned the conduct of the election, concluding that results were not a true reflection of the will of Zimbabweans. All three leaders had to agree for Zimbabwe to be suspended from the Commonwealth. Mbeki reluctantly voted for suspension to save the new Economic Partnership for Africa's Development, NEPAD, a multilateral initiative which was a cornerstone of Mbeki's vision for an African renaissance. Zimbabwe was given a list of reforms to undertake before its suspension could be lifted. The effect of these reforms would be to uphold the political and human rights of all Zimbabweans. The Secretary General of the Commonwealth, Don McKinnon, was tasked with working with the Zimbabwe government and the opposition to make the country compliant with the core values of this group of former British colonies. The regime of Robert Mugabe was defiant. Not a single reform was made. McKinnon was denied entry into Zimbabwe to carry out the task assigned to him. Yet Mbeki was hell-bent on pushing for the lifting of Zimbabwe's suspension at the Commonwealth Summit held in Nigeria in 2003. Zimbabwe's suspension was extended by an overwhelming majority of Commonwealth leaders. So infuriated was Mbeki that he wanted to read a dissenting statement on behalf of SADC, which opposed the extension. President Obasanjo refused to have the statement read on Nigerian soil on the grounds that only the official communique could be read. Botswana distanced itself from the so-called SADC statement Mbeki wanted to read. The Commonwealth story is narrated to show how determined Mbeki was, both as SADC mediator and as member of the Commonwealth Troika, to support a regime in Harare which would not allow its citizens the right to elect their government freely and peacefully. As a result, Zimbabweans fled from deteriorating political and economic conditions and settled in South Africa. According to authorities in Harare, an estimated 3 million Zimbabweans left the country between the years 2000 and 2010. The existence of so many Zimbabweans in South Africa is ample empirical evidence of the folly of placing the solidarity of former liberation movements above the interests of both the people of Zimbabwe and South Africa. Now it is the poor people, including those of other nations, engaged in protests and violence as they scrap for meager resources. Two facts must be pointed out here. First, South Africa is a sovereign state with a right to enforce its immigration laws. Second, economic conditions have deteriorated in South Africa with unemployment, poverty, crime, and squalor blighting the lives of millions. The pressure on health institutions, schools, and housing is bound to cause resentment and conflict. It is depressing to see that no lessons seem to have been learned by the South African government and indeed SADC about mistakes made in Zimbabwe. The same mistakes are being made in the region's response to Eswatini's dire political, human rights and economic situation. Perfunctory attention is being given to the pleas of the people of Eswatini who are denied the most basic political and human rights. When the inevitable happens, many more will flee to Mpumalanga and Gauteng provinces, further deepening the migrant crisis in South Africa. I thank you. Listeners, do you think I'm justified to be critical of Thabo Mbeki's handling of the Zimbabwe crisis? Do you agree that African leaders tend to turn a blind eye to misgovernance by their counterparts on the continent? Please post your comments below.